A cheating husband on the run, a wife with a hidden agenda, and a trail of money that leads straight into the lion's den. I thought it was just another job, until I became the next target. Have you ever noticed that air conditioners seem to work just fine in the winter, but the moment summer rolls around they give up like a beaten fighter in the 10th round? It was the peak of summer in Chicago, the kind of heat that could set a cigarette ablaze just by holding it out the window. The tiny air conditioning unit in my office had rattled its last breath 2 days ago, leaving me at the mercy of the sweltering air. Sweat trickled down my back, soaking into my already rumpled shirt. If I had my way, I'd be perched on a bar stool at Eddie's Lounge, nursing something cold with plenty of ice. But luck, for better or worse, wasn't on my side. I had an appointment, one I wasn't about to miss. I didn't recognize the name when she called, but her voice? It had the kind of sultry tone that lingered in a man's mind long after the line went dead. She didn't offer details, just that her husband had gone missing. And then with a soft click, she was gone. Now as I waited, I heard the distinct sound of high heels clicking down the hallway. A shadow stretched across the frosted glass of my door, pausing just long enough to read the black lettering. Jack Callahan, private investigator. I quickly buttoned the top of my shirt and straightened my tie, just as the door swung open. I've seen my share of beautiful women, but this one? She could have stepped straight out of the pages of Vogue. I stand at 6'2", and even in heels she wasn't much shorter, maybe 5'9" at most. Her blonde hair was long, expertly styled, and framed a face built for trouble. High cheekbones, full lips, and piercing blue eyes that had the kind of intensity that could strip a man down to his bones. She moved with an effortless grace, her tailored suit hugging every curve in just the right way. The skirt was short enough to turn heads but classy enough to leave something to the imagination. And those legs? They were the kind of legs a man might be willing to start a war over. I pushed myself up from my chair and extended a hand as she crossed the room, closing the 3 yards between us with measured steps. Jack Callahan, I introduced myself. Mrs. Richardson, she responded smoothly, lowering herself into the chair across from my desk. She crossed those impossibly long legs with a slow, deliberate motion, giving me a moment to register the name. Mrs. Arthur Richardson, she added, watching me closely. I barely managed to hide my reaction. That Arthur Richardson. The same Arthur Richardson who had made me look like a fool 2 years ago. She caught the flicker of recognition on my face and smiled, amused. That's right, Mr. Callahan. The very same Arthur Richardson who slipped through your fingers. She was teasing, but there was an edge to it. 2 years ago, Richardson had been skimming funds from his own company. His business partner suspected as much but couldn't prove it, so he hired me. I set up a sting operation that had Richardson cornered like a rat in a trap. The case went to trial, and for a while, it looked like justice was going to be served. Unfortunately, Richardson had money, and money had a way of finding the right people. He brought in a slick out-of-town attorney, a man who played the legal system like a grand piano. He discredited my testimony, twisted the facts, and before I knew it, my airtight case had sprung a dozen leaks. Richardson walked. It wasn't just bad for my pride. It was bad for business. Took me over a year to clean up the damage to my reputation. Mrs. Richardson tilted her head, studying me. I have to say, Mr. Callahan, she murmured, you're exactly? She smirked, giving me a slow once-over, her eyes scanning me like she was reading the pages of an open book. You're exactly what I imagined a private detective would be, she said. Tall, broad-shouldered, a little rough around the edges. That nose of yours, looks like it's been broken more than once. And those scars, one above your left eye, the other on your cheek, tell me you don't take favors from anyone. I chuckled. She had me pegged. All right, Mrs. Richardson, I said, leaning back in my chair. What can I do for you? Her lips curved slightly. I'm offering you a chance to even the score, Mr. Callahan. I raised an eyebrow. Even the score, huh? Arthur found out I was planning to divorce him, she explained, and he took off. Disappeared without a trace. He doesn't give a damn about me, but what he does care about is money. And divorce? That would cost him a lot. So he ran. My ears perked up at that. A man doesn't vanish just because his wife wants to leave him, unless he has something to lose. How long has he been gone? I asked. A little over a month. And the police? They made me file a missing persons report, she said, rolling her eyes. But I could tell they weren't interested. Just like me, they figure he's off somewhere playing house with one of his girlfriends. They showed me how to install some app on my phone to track his location, but he must be careful, he hasn't used it once. I nodded. That sounded about right. A man like Arthur Richardson didn't just vanish into thin air. He went where he wanted to go with whoever he wanted to be with. I know you don't usually take infidelity cases, she continued, crossing her legs again, but you do take missing persons cases. So, here's my offer, I'll pay you $220,000, plus expenses to find my husband. And if you can also get me proof that he's cheating, I'll throw in another $50,000 as a bonus. That got my attention. You suspect him of cheating? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Her laugh was dry. Oh, I know he's cheating. He's got at least 2 mistresses that I know of, and I'd bet my last dollar he's holed up with one of them right now. Which one? No clue, and I don't really care. I just need him found so I can serve him. I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a contract. With a few quick strokes of my pen, I adjusted the terms, $220,000 to find Arthur Richardson, $50,000 for proof of infidelity, and a $5,000 retainer to start. She signed without even glancing at the fine print. I don't have all $5,000 on me, she admitted, pulling a thick stack of bills from her designer purse. But I'll have someone bring the rest to you tomorrow afternoon. That won't be a problem, will it? I take checks, I told her. I'd rather not make you wait for it to clear, she replied smoothly. I counted out $3,300 in cash, handed her a receipt, and then spent the next hour grilling her with questions. Does he have close friends or family he might crash with? How much cash did he take when he left? Do you know if he has any offshore accounts? Does he own property out of state? Was he driving his own car? She answered each question with a precision that told me she had already thought through every angle. I jotted down notes, my mind already working through the possibilities. Arthur Richardson was on the run, but no one disappears without a trace. And for $270,000 I was about to make sure of that. She rattled off his driver's license number, along with every credit card, social security, and bank account details she had. But she suspected he had more accounts she wasn't privy to. When it came to his business dealings, though, she was in the dark. She had no idea about his partners or any ventures he might have been involved in. I, on the other hand, knew exactly what kind of man Arthur Richardson was. He had been forced out of his company after being caught with his hands in the till, but after the trial, I hadn't bothered keeping tabs on him. He was just another crook who had slipped through the cracks. As Mrs. Richardson stood to leave, I leaned back in my chair, watching her saunter toward the door. The sway of her hips was deliberate, calculated, and then I noticed something. The snug fit of her skirt left little to the imagination, and from what I could tell, she hadn't been wearing any underwear. I let out a low whistle in my head. Had she been sitting here the entire time like that? Was it the heat? Or was she using every tool in her arsenal to make sure I stayed motivated? If it was the latter, she needn't have worried. I had every intention of tracking her husband down and making sure he got exactly what was coming to him. And I was going to enjoy every second of handing him those divorce papers. But my mind wasn't just on Arthur Richardson. Lately, I had been working on something a lot bigger. A couple of months back, I had received an anonymous tip about a real estate scheme involving none other than the state's lieutenant governor. A little digging on my end had convinced me the tip was solid, but this wasn't some small-time con. I hate dirty cops. Hate corrupt politicians even more. But I knew better than to act without concrete proof. If I so much as hinted at what I knew before I had the evidence in hand, I could kiss my license goodbye. Or worse, end up behind bars myself. No thanks. Maybe this missing person case was exactly what I needed. A reason to keep my head down while letting my trail grow cold in case someone from the lieutenant governor's office started poking around. And if things went well, maybe I could even the score on 2 fronts. A few hours later, I found myself sitting across from Tom Walker, a man who had every reason to despise Arthur Richardson. Walker was a no-nonsense businessman, but at the moment he looked more like a man carrying the weight of a bad decision. His office was dimly lit, his expression even darker. He didn't even bother to hide his frustration. "I don't know why I'm even listening to you," he grumbled, leaning back in his chair. "The last time I took your advice, you assured me that my company would recover the money Richardson stole. Not only did we never see a dime of it, but I also had to pay your damn fee on top of it." I held my hands up in mock surrender. "Fair point. But I think you'll want to hear this." Walker sighed, rubbing his temple. "Fine. Say what you came here to say." I took a slow breath, letting the tension settle before dropping my next question. "Did Richardson ever mention both of his girlfriends to you?" Walker frowned. "You interacted with those women more than I did." "Why?" "Because I need their names," I said. "Addresses. Phone numbers." Walker scoffed. "I've got them. Hell, I even sent them flowers once." I raised an eyebrow at that, but I let it slide. Because if Richardson was hiding out with one of them, I was about to find out exactly where. Walker leaned back in his chair and sighed. I've got their information on my computer. Hell, Richardson even made me dial their numbers for him before picking up the phone. That was it. The motherlode. I kept my expression neutral, but inside I was already running through the possibilities. If Richardson had a pattern, if he had favorite spots, then there was a good chance he had a go-to place for his affairs. Any chance he had a secret love nest? I asked. Somewhere he'd keep his women stashed at night, away from prying eyes? Walker shook his head. If he did, I never heard about it. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The streets of downtown Chicago weren't any shadier than usual that night, but something wasn't sitting right with me. It was that nagging sensation in the back of my head, the one that tells you someone's watching. I scanned my surroundings, catching glimpses of the usual late-night crowd, street vendors, drunks, a few shady characters lingering by alleyways. But nothing stood out. Still, the last thing I wanted was to lead anyone straight to my two best leads. So instead of following my original plan, I detoured back to my office. As soon as I stepped inside, I locked the door, shrugged off my jacket, and unstrapped my shoulder holster. My Beretta went into the top drawer of my desk, right where I could reach it if I needed to. Then I moved to the file cabinet, pulling open the top drawer and retrieving something far more important at the moment. A bottle of Dewar's White Label and a glass. I needed a drink. 15 minutes later, I had company. Didn't know you were nearby, I said, barely looking up. Travis Ward, a former cop turned security specialist, strolled in with the casual ease of a man who had done this before. He didn't need to say a word. We had a routine for this kind of thing. He'd pretend he was just dropping by for a friendly chat while in reality he was sweeping my office for bugs. Sure enough, he found one, expertly hidden in the rail of my Venetian blinds. I let out a slow whistle. Whoever Richardson had hired wasn't some two-bit amateur. This was high-level surveillance work. We left the bug in place. No need to tip off whoever was listening that we were onto them. Come on, Angie, I'll walk you downstairs, I said, keeping my tone light. She folded her arms, tilting her head with that look that told me she wasn't buying it. In the interest of our little eavesdropper, I added. Her lips curled into a smirk, but she still hesitated. Wait a minute, I said, reaching for her arm, but she pulled away and stormed out, heels clicking against the floor. The door slammed so hard behind her that I half expected the glass panel to shatter. Damn, I muttered under my breath, leaning back in my chair with a grin. She'd be back. I never liked Derek Lawson. The guy called himself a private investigator, but I had a better term for him. A private idiot. He was the kind of guy that gave the rest of us a bad name. Which is why Mrs. Richardson was on her way to his office right now, to waste his time. She'd feed him fake information, string him along just enough to make him think he was onto something. And of course, she'd flash those blue eyes, maybe lean forward just enough to keep his attention locked on her black bodycon dress and high heels. She knew exactly what she was doing. Stace, if you weren't my ex-wife, I'd be on one knee right now, I joked, watching her saunter in. She smirked, flipping her hair over one shoulder. Excuses, she shot back. Sorry, Stace. I should have called. Didn't know you were on a date. She raised an eyebrow. And what's your excuse this time, Callahan? I just smiled. Because right now I had bigger things to deal with. Yes, she said, pulling the door open a little wider. Come in. I just need to grab my purse. I stepped inside, my eyes instinctively scanning the room. No sign of her companion. I don't want to intrude, Stace. I'll leave. You can't do it without me, she said, giving me a knowing look. I smirked. Keep up the good work and you won't need 20 minutes. Since when do you need an invitation? She teased. By the time 2 a.m. rolled around, we were both running on empty. Stacy curled up in my arms, her warmth pressing against me as we drifted off to sleep. I was caught in that twilight haze, that space between wakefulness and unconsciousness, when I heard her murmur, almost to herself, I love you, Blake. By morning, just as I'd expected, the bug in my office was gone. Presumably, it had found a new home in Newson's office. Clever. I wished I had time to sit back and enjoy the small victory, but I had bigger things to focus on. If my hunch was right, Mrs. Richardson's husband had a little hideaway tucked away somewhere, a place where no one would find him unless they knew exactly where to look. When I arrived at Janet's apartment, she answered the door almost immediately. Yes, of course. Come in, she said, stepping to the side. I walked in, taking a quick glance around. Nothing about her surroundings screamed, working-class secretary. Whoever was footing the bill for her lifestyle had deep pockets. The apartment was spacious, filled with expensive furniture, the kind you don't buy on a temp worker's salary. "Nice place," I said. "Thank you," she replied, her tone sharper than necessary. "So," she continued, folding her arms, "why exactly did you want to see me?" I glanced at the leather sofa, debating whether to sit. Instead, I leaned against the edge of a nearby table. "You interacted with Richardson more than anyone. Any idea where he might be hiding out?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second. "I think he has a little hideout somewhere, off the grid, out of sight. A place for after-hours activities." "So, you don't think he's been kidnapped or anything like that?" I watched her carefully. She shook her head. "No. If anything, he's avoiding his wife on purpose." "At this point, I'm not ruling anything out," I admitted. "But if I find his love nest and it's empty, it might indicate something else, something worse." Janet shifted, suddenly looking uneasy. "And what happens if you find him?" she asked. "His wife isn't stupid," I said. "If he's shacked up with someone, let it be. She just wants him served. The rest? That's between them." Later that night, I found myself outside a row of houses, studying the layout. Most of them had decent locks, nothing I couldn't pick, but that took time. And time wasn't on my side. Many of the houses had attached garages with automatic doors, the kind that ran on radio frequencies. Most people don't bother locking the interior door, meaning if you crack the garage, you've cracked the house. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small device about the size of a cigarette pack. I had picked it up a few years ago at Angie's Electronics. A handy little garage door opener decoder, one of my favorite investments. A short while later, I was parked near a grocery store a few blocks from Janet's house, binoculars in hand. Now all I had to do was wait. I watched as she disappeared into the Walmart building, grabbing one of the large carts near the entrance. That meant she'd be in there for a while. Perfect. This was my chance. Moving quickly, I doubled back to the apartment building, slipping through the garage entrance with the help of my trusty decoder device. I took the elevator up to the second floor and got to work. Household locks? A pain to pick. But the cheap locks developers slap onto apartment doors? Not much of a challenge. With the job done, I headed home to catch a few hours of sleep. The next morning, I placed a call. "Mrs. Richardson, this is Blake McDaniels. Would you mind dropping off the divorce papers at my office sometime today? If not, I can swing by and pick them up." "Have you found him yet?" she nearly shouted. I never made promises to clients until everything was locked and airtight. "Not exactly," I told her. "But I have a solid lead. If everything plays out the way I expect, I'll be looking your future ex in the eyes by tomorrow morning." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she exhaled sharply, frustration, maybe hope. Either way, she knew I was getting close. Later that afternoon, I sat across from Stacy, watching as she cradled her coffee cup in both hands. She stared down at it, silent for a few seconds, long enough for me to tell something was weighing on her. Finally she spoke. "Last night you made a comment," she said. "You said that if I weren't already your ex-wife, you'd propose to me." I nodded. "Yeah. Have you ever actually thought about it? About us, about getting married again?" The question caught me off guard. I leaned back, letting her words sink in. As the old song goes, we got married in a rush. Back then, my life was a whirlwind of missions, investigations, and Stacy. A mutual friend introduced us one night, and by the next morning, we had already burned through an entire hotel minibar and a half-dozen poor life choices. I looked at her now, still as beautiful as ever, still the woman who knew me better than anyone. And yet, the idea of being married to Stacy again wasn't repulsive, but it wasn't something I could jump into either. I sighed. "I need to think, Stace. Give me some time." She lowered her eyes, her lips curving into a sad, knowing smile, like she already knew my answer wouldn't be the one she wanted. "No pressure, Blake," she murmured. "I just thought it was worth bringing up." The conversation put a damper on the rest of our lunch. As I got up to leave, I kissed her softly on the lips. "I will think about it," I told her. That seemed to brighten her mood just a little. Back at my office, I was already shifting gears. A couple of miles ahead, I watched my target move. "Before we start tailing her," I muttered, "let's make sure she never even knows we're back here." The man beside me let out a low whistle. "God, I'm impressed," he said. "It's like..." I smirked, keeping my eyes locked on the road. "Like I know what I'm doing?" "I'm riding with James Bond," Mrs. Richardson said with a smirk. "Not really," I replied. Bond's tracking devices had limited range. Ours? Powered by satellites. If our unsuspecting prey drove all the way to Montana, we'd still be on his tail. Right on cue, the large garage door groaned open. "Just in time," I muttered. The sleek silver cabriolet rolled out, gliding onto the street. I glanced at my laptop screen. The signal was strong. Exactly where I wanted them. Inside, Richardson was caught completely off guard. His soon-to-be ex-wife threw a thick envelope onto the table in front of him. "Sign them," she snapped. Richardson's jaw tightened, but he reached for the envelope, flipping it open. I was only half watching, making sure he didn't try anything stupid. But when I caught sight of the papers inside, my stomach twisted. Blank. Not a single word on them. From the corner of my eye, I spotted Carlo, Richardson's hired muscle, grinning like a shark. Richardson chuckled, tossing the empty envelope onto the table. "This will make a great epitaph for you," he sneered. He thought of everything, but not this. Mrs. Richardson's confidence started to crack. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Her fear? Way out of proportion for a woman who had just been duped in a divorce scheme. And then it clicked. She wasn't scared of Richardson. She was scared of whoever else was in the room. "Come on, Eric," Carla hissed, nudging the man beside her. "Shoot him and let's get out of here." "Wait," I said, keeping my hands up but my mind racing. "This doesn't make sense. At least tell me why I'm about to die." Eric hesitated. Carla didn't. "Just shoot him, honey. Beautiful or not, I really didn't like her." A slow, twisted smile spread across the lieutenant governor's face. No, honey," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "He's right. He already knows he's being played." He lifted the gun slightly, tilting it so I could get a good look. It wasn't his. It was Richardson's. "He left this when he ran off," the governor mused. "So first I shoot you with his gun." He shifted his aim. "Then I shoot him with your gun." He smirked, lifting his gaze as if reading the invisible headlines above us. "Personal vendetta ends in gunfire, 2 dead." "Oh yeah," he murmured, "that's just lovely." I exhaled slowly. I needed time. "What about Janet?" I asked, shifting my weight slightly. The governor sighed, barely glancing at the woman in question. "Yeah, about that," he said, his tone almost bored. He turned toward her. "You were convenient," he added. Janet's eyes widened. She wasn't just a witness anymore. She was a liability. "You should have guessed, Carla," I said, shifting my attention to her. She narrowed her eyes at me. "I tried damn hard to track down the money your husband embezzled. And you know what I found?" "Nothing," she snapped. "Exactly." I took a slow step forward, testing the shaky balance of power in the room. A man who's that good at making money disappear doesn't suddenly lose his touch when it comes to divorce court. He convinced the judge he was broke. And what did that mean for you, Carla? I let the moment sink in. You got nothing. The air in the room was thick with tension. I had seconds to make my next move. And if I didn't? I wasn't making it out of there alive. "You know," I said, swirling the last of my whiskey, "I thought it was a little strange that you didn't want to pay me by check." Carla blinked, still shaken. Not many women feel comfortable carrying that much cash around. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her face crumbling. Tears welled up. "I really thought we were all going to die," she sobbed. While Richardson muttered soft reassurances, I wandered over to his bar cart and poured 3 whiskeys. "Here," I said, setting 2 glasses down on the table. Janet shakily reached for hers, hands trembling as she took a sip. It took an hour, and a few stiff drinks, before she could string together a full sentence again. When she finally did, her words made sense. At least to me. I was starting to believe her. And then she lifted her gaze to me, her expression raw. "Mr. McDaniels," she said, voice hoarse, "we owe you our lives." I left them there, Richardson arguing over the money, Janet still shaken, and headed home. I was exhausted, starving, and planning to spend the next few hours on the road. Before heading out, I stopped at a quaint little country diner for breakfast. The long drive ahead didn't bother me. What did was Stacy's suggestion that we try again. Being single was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, I had complete freedom, to go where I needed, do what I needed. No checking in, no explanations. But on the other, I let the thought hang, stirring my coffee absently. By the time the forensics expert had come and gone, it was past 6 o'clock. I stopped at a cafe on the way home, then collapsed into bed the second I walked into my apartment. The ringing phone jolted me awake the next morning. I groggily reached for it, blinking at the missed call stacked on my screen. "Hello," I muttered, voice still thick with sleep. "Mr. McDaniels," a woman's voice responded crisply. "This is Eloise Harding from the Chicago Tribune." I sat up. I'm waiting outside your office, she continued. Are you coming in anytime soon? I rubbed my eyes. What's the matter? By the time I finally dragged myself into the office, it was already 3 p.m. I considered calling Eloise back. Never hurts to get free publicity, or maybe heading to Plato's for a drink instead. I was still mulling it over when I heard my door creak open. I glanced up, expecting another reporter. But the man standing in the doorway? Now that was a surprise. It took a lot to catch me off guard, but this? I wasn't sure whether to reach for my gun or not. Richardson? I said slowly. He didn't answer. Just stood there. Silent. Watching me. Richardson sank into the chair across from me, tossing a letter-sized envelope onto my desk. I eyed it, then him. And this is... He let out a dry chuckle. A parting gift. I slid the envelope closer but didn't open it yet. I wanted answers first. You always knew Walker was a snake, Richardson said, rubbing his temple. I knew it too. That's why I started putting together my own golden parachute. A little safety net for when the whole thing came crashing down. And that worked out great for you, I muttered. He exhaled sharply. Yeah. Right up until I burned through $4 million in a year. I let out a low whistle. Impressive. And by impressive I mean unbelievably stupid. Richardson laughed bitterly. My biggest mistake? Underestimating you. You caught me red-handed, but I knew you'd never find the money. So how did Carla get her hands on those numbers? He shook his head. No idea. Must have been some dumb accident. Maybe she stumbled across an old account statement, maybe she got lucky. But she found it. And Janet? How did she end up in this mess? Richardson's expression softened for the first time. She was my savior, he admitted. I met her at a time when I had nowhere else to turn. I studied him for a moment, then finally opened the envelope. Inside was a check, made out to me, for $100,000. I blinked, almost expecting it to vanish into thin air. That's real, Richardson said, reading my expression. On the way home, I stopped by my accountant's office and handed it over. Put $20,000 into my account, I told him. And figure out how to keep the rest away from Uncle Sam, legally, of course. The next morning, I walked into Walker's outer office. Dory, his secretary, glanced up from her desk and sighed dramatically. You're like a bad Penny McDaniels? I smirked. You love me, dollface. Now, why don't you tell Walker I have something for him? She rolled her eyes and pressed the intercom. After lunch, I found myself back at my office, where Eloise Harding was waiting for me. The Chicago Tribune reporter was as cute as a kitten, all big, curious eyes and the kind of charm that could get a guy into trouble. A week ago, I wouldn't have hesitated to dance between the sheets with her. But now, for some reason it just felt wrong. Later that night, I checked my bank balance and smiled when I saw that $20,000 had already hit my account. I took a chance on something different. Stacy. And when I walked into the bar, I heard a round of cheers and applause, from both patrons and staff. Looks like you had a good day, someone called out. I smirked, took a seat and lifted my glass. I have a good accountant, I said. I knew he'd invest wisely, which meant I could be more selective with the cases I took on. More than that, life with Stacy was damn near perfect. And for the first time in a long time I was actually looking forward to the future.